She was 17 years old. She weighed 112 pounds. On the evening of October 8, 1971, she walked out of the Dairy Maid on Route 9 in Tishomingo, Oklahoma, carrying her work apron folded over her arm, and nobody with a reason to harm her was supposed to know she'd be walking home alone that night. That is not a story about a girl who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is a story about a man who had been watching her for months and had chosen his moment with precision. And it would take 53 years, 2 generations of investigators, and a DNA profile sitting untouched in a state evidence archive to finally put a name to what he did. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to 1971. Because to understand what was lost on that October evening, you first have to understand who Darlene Faye Moss was. Tishomingo is the county seat of Johnston County, Oklahoma, a town of roughly 3,000 people sitting in the Arbuckle foothills in the southern part of the state, close enough to the Texas border that the culture ran more ranching than farming, and where the evenings in October could drop 40 degrees from the afternoon high before the sun was fully down. In 1971, the town had one stoplight, a grain elevator visible from most of the main streets, and the kind of mutual familiarity that meant a stranger's car parked somewhere unusual would be noticed and discussed by nightfall. Darlene Moss was a junior at Tishomingo High School that year. She was the kind of student her teachers described in careful, specific terms. Not a superlative, not a cliché, but something real. Her English teacher, Frances Albright, would say decades later that Darlene was the first student she ever had who read the assigned chapter and then asked what happened next. She had a plan. After graduation, she intended to study nursing at East Central University in Ada, 40 minutes north. She had been saving money from her hours at the Dairy Maid since the previous spring, tucking the bills into an envelope she kept in her sock drawer, marked in her own handwriting, college. She was the oldest of 4 children. Her father, Roy, ran a small engine repair shop out of the family property on Ravia Road. Her mother, Gloria, worked the lunch counter at the Rexall drugstore on Main. Their station wagon, a 1968 Ford Country Squire with the wood paneling peeling at the rear corners, was how the family moved through the world. Church on Sundays, football games in the fall, the occasional drive to Ardmore for school clothes when the budget allowed. Darlene rode in the middle row because her brothers claimed the back, and her little sister always needed the window. She had never once complained about it. She had a habit of braiding a single thin strand of her hair when she was thinking hard. Her sister Tammy would remember this for the rest of her life, the way Darlene's fingers would go to that strand without her seeming to notice. She had gotten her ears pierced that summer, small silver studs, and she wore them every day. She was proud of them. That was the last October she would ever have. In 40 minutes, none of it would matter anymore. Darlene's shift at the Dairy Maid ended at 8 o'clock in the evening. Her father had planned to pick her up, but the truck he was repairing for a customer had taken longer than expected, and Roy Moss called the Dairy Maid at 7:45 to say he'd be another 30 minutes. The owner, Gary Teague, relayed the message. Darlene told him she'd walk. It was less than a mile. She knew every house on the route, and it wasn't the first time. She left the Dairy Maid at approximately 8:05 p.m. Teague watched her cross the parking lot from the window. She turned north on Bird Avenue. That was the last confirmed sighting. Roy Moss arrived at the Dairy Maid at 8:38 p.m. to an empty parking lot. Teague told him Darlene had walked. Roy drove the route home, slowly, watching both sides of the road. The house was dark when he arrived. Gloria had not seen her. Roy drove the route again. He stopped at 2 neighbors' houses. Nobody had seen her pass. He called the Johnston County Sheriff's Office at 9:15 p.m. Deputies began searching by 9:30. By midnight, they had covered Bird Avenue and the 3 residential streets that connected her workplace to her home. Nothing by the following morning, a formal search had been organized, drawing in volunteers from the Baptist Church and the high school coaching staff. They walked the creek beds and the scrubland east of town through a cold, overcast Saturday. On the afternoon of October 10th, 2 days after she disappeared, a highway department crew clearing brush along the shoulder of State Highway 78, 4 miles southeast of town, found Darlene Moss in a shallow depression beside a drainage culvert. She had been covered with brush and dirt. The Johnston County Medical Examiner was called. Cause of death was established. The case was reclassified from missing persons to homicide. Roy Moss had to be told in the driveway of his own home, with his engine repair shop visible behind him and Gloria inside with the other 3 children, not yet knowing. A single button was recovered near the scene. It did not match anything Darlene had been wearing. It was logged into evidence, placed in a small envelope, and filed. Nobody knew then how important that button would not turn out to be. What mattered was something too small to see. The lead investigator was Johnston County Sheriff's Deputy Harlan Odell, 44 years old in 1971. A Korean War veteran who had joined the department in 1958, and who ran his investigations with the focused, unhurried patience of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that rushing was how you missed things. He interviewed 63 people in the first 6 weeks. He had a spiral notebook for each significant person of interest, and he organized them in a wooden box on his desk that he called, with no particular humor, the library. 2 men rose to the top of his attention early. The first was a mechanic in his late 20s named Cleet Norris, who had spoken to Darlene at the Dairy Maid on multiple occasions and who, according to 2 of her co-workers, had made her uncomfortable enough that she had mentioned it to Teague. Norris was brought in for questioning twice. His alibi for the night of October 8th was his wife, who confirmed he had been home. A search of his vehicle and property produced nothing. He was not charged, though Odell kept his notebook. The second was a 29-year-old man named Gerald Fenn, who lived 6 blocks from the Dairy Maid and who had a prior arrest in Texas for a different matter entirely. Fenn submitted to questioning willingly, almost eagerly, Odell noted, in a way that sat wrong with him, but was not evidence of anything. Fenn had been at a church social that evening, confirmed by the pastor and 4 other attendees. He was eliminated. The button recovered at the scene was sent to the state crime lab. No match could be established. There was biological evidence recovered during the medical examiner's examination, preserved according to the protocol of the time in the State Evidence Archive in Oklahoma City. In 1971, there was no technology to extract useful information from it. It was cataloged, sealed, and stored. The archive kept it because protocol required it, not because anyone expected it to matter. Darlene Moss's case did not close. It was never solved. By the end of 1972, the active investigation had slowed to a file that Odell reviewed quarterly. He retired in 1984 with the Moss case unresolved. It was, his daughter said at his funeral in 2003, the thing that bothered him most about his career. He'd talked about it in his final years. He never stopped wondering about the button. The button was not the answer. But Odell had been right to stay bothered. Gloria Moss did not move from Tishomingo. She stayed in the house on Ravia Road, and she raised her 3 remaining children, and she went to the Rexall lunch counter every weekday morning, and she spoke at the annual Remembrance Vigil at Grace Baptist every October for 31 years, until her own health made it impossible. By 2000, the vigil was being organized by Tammy, Darlene's youngest sister, now 50 years old, with grandchildren of her own, living 20 miles away in Medill. Tammy had spent 30 years as a school counselor. She had never stopped. Every October 8th, she put fresh flowers at the small marker her family had placed at the site on Highway 78. Carnations, usually, because Darlene had liked carnations and had once said roses were a cliché. She drove out there alone in the early morning before the traffic, and she stood for a while, and she drove home. She did this every year. People who knew her understood that you did not schedule anything else for Tammy on October 8th. By 2010, 39 years had passed. The house Darlene grew up in had been sold when Roy and Gloria could no longer maintain it. Roy had died in 1997, Gloria in 2006. The Dairy Maid on Route 9 had long since become a tire shop. The old Johnston County Sheriff's files were digitized in 2015 as part of a state cold case initiative, and Darlene's case received a new case number and a brief review by a cold case unit that noted the archived biological evidence as a potential forensic asset. If the sample had degraded, this would lead nowhere. If it had held, there was a possibility. That review went into a queue. The queue was long. Tammy called the sheriff's office every October. They knew her voice. They were always kind. They always said the case was open. If you've stayed with this story this far, it means something to you. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, cross-referencing records, and sitting with families who have waited years for someone to tell their story with care. If you want us to keep doing that, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Darlene. In the spring of 2023, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation announced an expansion of its Cold Case DNA initiative, applying forensic genealogy to biological evidence from unresolved homicides dating back to the 1960s. The Moss case was selected for inclusion, partly because of Tammy's annual calls to the sheriff's office, which had been noted in the case file, and partly because a 2022 internal review flagged the archived sample as having survived in conditions sufficient for extraction. Forensic genealogy works by uploading a DNA profile derived from crime scene evidence to public ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people research their family trees, and using shared genetic markers to identify distant relatives. Then, trace those relatives back toward a single unknown contributor. It had solved cases as old as 50 years. The Moss case was 52. The Osby analyst assigned to the case was a woman named Dana Perkins, 12 years in forensic services, who had worked 4 prior genealogy cases. She submitted the extracted profile to the database in August 2023 and began the painstaking process of tracing the genetic tree. It was not fast. The most distant relatives were found first, second and third cousins, people who had no idea their DNA would be part of this. She built the tree by hand, branch by branch, working backward and inward toward the contributor. She did this work for 7 months. In March 2024, the tree converged on a single family in Johnston County. One household. One man who had lived in Tishomingo in 1971, who had been there the whole time. His name was Earl Douglas Hatcher. He was 80 years old. Hatcher had been born and raised in Tishomingo. In 1971, he was 27 years old, working at the grain elevator on the south edge of town and living in a rental house 4 blocks from the Dairy Maid. He had been interviewed by Deputy Odell in November 1971, briefly, as one of dozens of people connected to the Route 9 corridor. He had been cooperative and unremarkable. He was not a suspect. He was a background name in a spiral notebook that went into the wooden box and stayed there. In the decades that followed, he built a life that gave no visible indication of what he had done. He married in 1974. He had 2 sons. He served as a deacon at First Baptist Church of Tishomingo for 19 years. He was president of the Johnston County Cattlemen's Association in 1998 and 1999. When the local paper ran a piece on longtime community contributors in 2015, his photograph appeared in the second row. Investigators confirmed through cell phone records and physical surveillance that Hatcher was still living in Tishomingo when the genealogy results came back in March 2024. A court-authorized DNA sample was obtained covertly in April, collected from a cup he discarded after a meeting at his church. The sample was sent to the state lab for direct comparison. The match was confirmed on May 19, 2024, 53 years after October 8, 1971. The DNA from the biological evidence archived since the year of Darlene Moss's death matched Earl Douglas Hatcher with a probability that the lab report described as a virtual certainty. The arrest took place on a Tuesday morning in June 2024. Osby agents and Johnston County deputies arrived at Hatcher's home on Farm Road 1310 at 7 a.m. He was in his kitchen when they knocked. His wife of 50 years was at the table. He was taken out of his own house in handcuffs while she stood in the doorway watching. The community reaction was not uniform. It was not simple. People who had sat beside Earl Hatcher in church pews for 4 decades were quiet for a long time. Some said they couldn't believe it. Some said they didn't want to believe it. A few, who thought back carefully over the years, said there had always been something they couldn't name, a stillness in him that felt like control rather than calm. The pastor of First Baptist issued a statement asking for prayer for all families involved. He did not specify which families he meant. Tammy Moss learned of the arrest from a phone call from the Osby investigator who had worked the genealogy analysis. She was in her kitchen in Medill. She sat down at the table and did not get up for a long time. She later told the Tishomingo News that she had spent 53 years afraid that the answer, when it finally came, would feel like nothing, like something hollow. She said it did not feel like nothing. She said it felt like her sister's name being said out loud in a room that had been silent for 53 years. Hatcher was charged with first-degree murder. He was held without bail. In February 2025, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and a trial that could not be won, he entered a guilty plea. He was sentenced, at 81 years old, to life in prison. He will die there. He did not speak to Tammy in the courtroom. He did not look at her. She looked at him. She had waited long enough to look at him, and she was not going to give that up. Darlene Faye Moss was 17 years old. She had a plan for her life and an envelope in her sock drawer with money she had earned herself, marked college in her own handwriting. She had silver stud earrings she was proud of, and a habit of braiding a single strand of hair when she was concentrating, and a little sister who watched her hands and remembered them for 53 years. She had a mother who kept going to work, and a father who drove the same route home twice that night, slowly, watching both sides of the road. She had wanted to be a nurse. She had wanted to help people. She had been saving up. Tammy still drives to the marker on Highway 78 every October 8th. She has driven that road for more than half a century. She says she will keep driving it. She says Darlene was not a cold case. She was a girl. She was her sister. She was someone who had earned the right to a future. And it was taken from her, and she is owed the dignity of being remembered as more than the year she disappeared. She is right. What does it say about a community any community, that a man can commit an act of violence and then spend 53 years at the center of public life, trusted, honored, elected to positions of civic responsibility, and that the only force powerful enough to reach him was a science that didn't yet exist when he committed his crime. What does it mean that Tammy's annual phone calls, which some might have called futile, were documented in that case file and influenced the decision to include this case in the genealogy initiative? And what do you do with the particular grief of being the person who waited the longest, and who finally, at the end of an entire life of waiting, received an answer that is true but cannot restore one single thing that was taken? Justice found Darlene Moss after 53 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, and that the people we lose deserve to be remembered fully, not just solved, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.